Perhaps you've seen the Christmas card with the three wise men on it. Well, there are lots of Christmas cards with the three wise men on it. They're varied, aren't they? But my favorite one, they're not men, they're women. And you may have heard the story, the old joke that goes with this card. What if there had been wise women instead of wise men? Now think about that for a moment. Inside the card, it said, if the three wise men had been women, they would not have gotten lost. They would have arrived on time to help deliver the baby. And they would have brought practical gifts, skipping the gold, the frankincense, and the myrrh. And they would have cleaned the stable and left Mary with a casserole for dinner. You know, the truth is we really know almost nothing about these wise men, these kings from the East, in spite of the fact that The Economist this week, of all magazines, its feature story was about the wise men. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to do so. But it delves into the question of who were these figures, these characters who appear in Matthew's gospel. And Matthew's gospel alone, they were from the East. Well, how far east? Was it all the way as far as the end of the Silk Road? Or was it somewhere between Bethlehem and Afghanistan? How far east? Matthew's image was that they came from a long way away, but no specifics. It's a strange story, and it's the only account of this in the Gospels. Luke has shepherds. Luke has angels. Luke has animals. John has the beginning, and in the beginning was the Word. Mark has nothing. Mark doesn't mention the nativity story. Matthew is the only one who talks about these wise men. So why did Matthew include it? Well, to Matthew's readers, the tyranny that was described of Herod the king rang true. Clearly, they would understand Matthew's message that Jesus was born in an atmosphere of violence and terror. Violence and terror that was supported by the Roman government, which had destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, some 40 years after the death of Jesus, and some years prior to the writing of Matthew's gospel. Well, how many wise men were there? Well, we always have three in our pageants, right? So there must have been three. The evidence, the written evidence, is not there, but Christian tradition says anywhere from 3 to 20. But we picked three because of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And so we had to have one wise man in our pageant to carry each one of those gifts. So we came up with three. 2nd century, the Christian leader Tertullian suggested that these wise men were kings because the prophets had predicted that the kings would come and worship Jesus, the Messiah, the anointed one of God. But he also concluded that there were three kings because of the gold, the frankincense, and the myrrh. By the 3rd century, biblical interpreters were finding echoes of Psalm 72, in which three gift-bearing visitors, the kings of Tarshish and the isles, may render to him tribute. May the kings of Sheba and Seba bring gifts. May all kings fall down before him. May all nations serve him. These kings, these magi, these wise men, came from all nations, became the tradition. They all came and bowed down and worshiped the babe. They became a potent sign that Christ's salvation was predicted and that it was open to the whole world. The rising of a new star, they believed, was the dividing point between the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, and the New Covenant. But strangely, the Bible doesn't tell us who they were or how many of them were there. Regardless of where they came from or how they knew, they were outsiders. They were foreigners. Their mother wasn't born in Virginia. Matthew tells us that they traveled far. And they brought the gifts. And his purpose was to proclaim a message that God's revelation was for all people, or as The Economist puts it, for every man. Thus, the story is one of universal salvation, a proclamation that no one is to be excluded from God's love. So this story, this little story in Matthew's gospel that isn't found anywhere else, is Matthew's gospel. It's the good news of Jesus Christ according to Matthew. That the love of God is for all people, regardless of where they come from or who they are or what gifts they bring. It seems to me that Matthew's reader is called to understand something about the reality of life, something about the nature of God. But the story also acknowledges the reality of evil, those who would do us harm, those who would take life, those who would destroy what is healthy, and do this out of a desire for power and control. Herod represents that evil. Herod represents the one who seeks to maintain his power, regardless of what he has to do to keep that. There is evidence that Herod not only killed 2 of his wives and 3 of his sons, or maybe I have that backwards, and some 300 of his assistants, his attendants. This man was a horrible man, and he plays a role in this story to show us that evil is part of life, that the power of evil is real, and we have to deal with it. Evil tears down, evil destroys, evil divides and separates, and it prevents us from leading the kind of life that God would intend us to lead. So it's clear to me that the writer of this gospel wanted us to understand that the life that Jesus was living was real. It was hard, that he was vulnerable, that there was no comfortable place, no safe place for this king. Instead, his early life was the life of a refugee, fleeing from Palestine, fleeing, according to Matthew's gospel, to Egypt. And like all refugees across the world from then until now, they must have been filled with fear and with anxiety about the future. So the followers of the way of Jesus, for whom this account was written, would have heard the story in the light of the story of the Hebrew people who were brought out of bondage in Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, and brought into the land of promise. They would have heard this story in the light of the story of Moses being called by God. And when Moses said to God, "What is your name? What name shall I tell them?" God said, "I am. I am sends you." Or in one translation, "I am there." So the Hebrew people were told that "I am there with you" was with them throughout their journey. So the people who heard Matthew's gospel would hear, "I am there" is with you. So in the midst of the sea or the wilderness or the mountains, God was there. So as Mary and Joseph fled Herod's wrath, they knew that God was there. So the writer of the gospel wanted his reader to know that even in the midst of violence, even in the midst of terrifying fear, even in the midst of homelessness, the young family faced the reality of the fragility of life in such a way that they were able to nurture and to love Jesus in his infancy and his childhood, giving him a foundation of confidence on which would rest his absolute trust in the protective and empowering love of God. Martin Smith, some of you knew him as the head of SSJE, others as the retired Bishop of Massachusetts, wrote about Joseph, "In my imagination, I can see the icon of Joseph I would like. It comes to me sometimes at the Sursham Quarter at the Eucharist when we say, 'Lift up your hearts.' Deep down," Smith says, "these words touch a chord of our memory of having been lifted up by our fathers. Lifted up and held high. That memory of warmth and caring, of love." I thought of this week as my son sent an Instagram of his holding his son Ellis high in the air and then putting him on his shoulders and carrying him around. It's that lifting up. Lift up your hearts. Swoop him up into the air. Daddy is the response. Daddy. Imagine the image of Joseph lifting Jesus high into the air while Jesus cried, "Abba, Father." As I think of Matthew's story of Joseph, I am moved by how he chose to face his difficulties with such grace as to teach Jesus how to love in spite of the horror of their near escape. Moving into this new year, a year like last year, but with its own set of fears, its own anxieties, its own concerns and worries, its own challenges. Let us note the willingness of the Magi to risk extravagantly in order to lay their gifts at the altar of God. And let us look also at the ability of Joseph to hear the message of the angels, even in the midst of life-threatening danger, to give the boy Jesus a foundation of confidence on which would rest his absolute trust and love of God. Whether acknowledged this way or not, most people I know long for that kind of intimacy with Christ, so that you can reach out and touch him and know his healing touch as well. I don't know what you need to risk in order to lay your gifts at the altar. I don't know what message God's angels might have for you, but I do know that the grace you might need to rely on as you face the realities of life comes from God, for God is there. I do know that it is a good time to look honestly at life, to re-examine our priorities, to know that we stand on the threshold of a new opportunity to walk closer to God. And I invite you to come along, believing deeply wherever you go, whatever the circumstances are, whatever the joy and the hope and the love might be, but whatever the challenges might be as well. I invite you to come along, for God is there. God is with you every step of the way. Amen.